She blocked the corridor. He stopped running from the truth. HFY Sci-Fi romance. The maintenance corridor on Deck 7 was supposed to be empty. That was the whole point. Davin Creel had spent 4 days mapping the dead zones of Way Station Cathara, the stretches of passage too narrow for patrol drones, the camera blind spots where the arc of the sweep left a 3-second gap, the cargo crawlways that smelled like coolant and old grease and absolute solitude. He knew every exit route on this station the way a man knows the inside of a prison, because that was exactly what Cathara was to him, a place he needed to leave before anyone realized he'd arrived. He'd done this before. Not just here, on 11 other stations in the last 3 months, varying approaches, varying timing, always the maintenance level, always the camera gap. The first few times he'd been terrified. By the 6th station, the terror had settled into something duller, a practiced, almost professional routine of invisibility that he'd gotten very good at, and that he told himself was careful and told himself was smart, and did not tell himself was also the posture of a man who had come to believe, in some deep and unaddressed place, that he was not supposed to be seen. He moved at the 3-second gap. He always moved at the 3-second gap. The kit bag was light. He'd learned early that weight slowed the thinking, that everything you carried was one more thing that could snag on a railing or unbalance you at the wrong moment. What he had was what fit in a field bag: 3 changes of clothes, a med kit, a water processor, the forged transit chip, and a single photograph his sister had pressed into his hand the day he'd left home. He hadn't looked at the photograph in 6 weeks. He knew exactly where it was. He was halfway down the length of the corridor, kit bag over one shoulder, forged transit chip pressed flat against the inside of his wrist, counting steps in the absent, calibrated way of someone who has measured this passage before, when the lights came on. Not the emergency reds, the full whites. The brutal, overhead, nowhere to hide whites, the kind that turned everything under them into flat angles and eliminated shadow entirely. He stopped breathing for a beat. And at the far end of the corridor, where the passage turned toward the docking ring, something stepped into the opening and stood there. Not something, someone. She was tall, taller than him by a full head, which meant she cleared the low passage without ducking, which no human managed in this corridor without an instinctive hunch of the shoulders. Her skin was the deep blue-black of a deep ocean sky just before it swallowed the last of the light, and it had a faint luminescent undertow to it, something bioluminescent moving in the dermal layers, he thought, visible only because the overhead whites were so merciless. Her hair was silver white, cropped close on one side and longer on the other, the longer section swept back and clasped with something that looked like a smoothed vertebra from an animal he didn't recognize. Her eyes were completely white, no visible iris, no pupil, but they tracked him with the precision of a targeting system locking range. She wore Catharan Station security armor. Not the patrol-grade shell that the junior staff wore, the kind with the visible neck seam and the scuffed knee plates and the slightly ill-fitting chest piece, because they were mass-manufactured for the species' median form. The real kind. The kind that had been fitted, that moved with its wearer, that showed the specific wear patterns of years of use without losing structural integrity. The kind you only earned. She had both arms at her sides. She was not drawing a weapon. She was not stepping forward. She was just standing there, blocking the corridor, the full whites overhead making both of them stark and specific. Davin did not run. Running would have been faster, but running was also the thing that told them everything. It told them the direction, the intent, the degree of desperation. He'd run corridors before at the beginning, and running only made the chase specific. He stood still instead. He breathed slowly, 1 cycle, 2. He kept his eyes on her face. He calculated exits behind him. The camera gap closed in 2 seconds, and the corridor ended in a maintenance crawl too small for a standard patrol to follow. Ahead, she was blocking the only exit to the docking ring. He looked at the exits, and he did not move toward either. "Transit chip," she said. Her voice was low, measured, professionally neutral, and her standard was almost perfect, almost, because there was a slight lateral consonant shift that marked her as Veldaren or possibly Kethcast, though he couldn't have said how he knew that, only that he did. He'd spent time near the Vel system in the second year of his service. He'd retained things he hadn't consciously learned. "On my wrist," he said. "Show me." He pulled his sleeve back and pressed the chip up toward the light so she could read it without stepping closer. A full 3 seconds passed. She didn't use a scanner. She looked at it the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not at the numbers, but at what the image contained that the numbers didn't say. "That chip was issued at Waystation Duvara," she said. 41 standard days ago." "That's right. Duvara is 11 days from here at commercial transit speeds. I had layovers. 4 of them," she said, "each conveniently too short to clear biometric registration at the transit hubs." Davin said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The math was the math. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, not a human gesture, more like a sensor adjustment, a realignment of the instruments she was using to read him. The luminescent undertow in her skin moved when she moved, a fractional shimmer that tracked the angle of her body like something alive in the dark of her. He noticed that with the detached, involuntary attention of a man who has trained himself to notice everything and care about very little. "Your name," she said. "Davin Creel." It was the name on the chip. It was also his actual name, which was either a mistake or the only honest thing he'd done in 3 months, and he wasn't sure which. He'd thought about using an alias. He hadn't been able to make himself do it. He wasn't sure why. "Davin Creel," she repeated, not like she was tasting it, but like she was filing it, placing it in a location so she could find it again. "Where were you stationed before Duvara?" He didn't answer. She didn't push. She just waited, with the particular quality of stillness that meant she could wait a great deal longer than he could, and she knew it, and she was comfortable with him knowing it too. Her armor was still, no idle adjusting, no weight shifting from foot to foot. The white eyes didn't blink at the rate human eyes blinked. He'd read something about that once, about Velcast species and their ocular membranes. And standing in the harsh light at 2 in the station's night cycle with his chip exposed and his exits blocked, he found himself thinking about it with the slightly absurd clarity of a mind that is very good at focusing on details when the large thing is too much. "You are not registered in the current Kithara manifest," she said finally. "You are standing in a maintenance corridor during the security cycle wearing a transit chip that has had its location signature suppressed. Not removed, suppressed, which is a more expensive and more specific modification that requires either military-grade tools or access to someone who has them. And you have not answered a direct question from a station security officer." She paused, and in the pause the station breathed around them, the hum of the environmental systems and the distant clunk of a docking arm cycling through its overnight protocol. Most people in that situation try to explain something. "Most people have something that would help," Davin said. It came out quieter than he'd intended, not evasive, not clever. Just tired in the specific way of a statement that is more true than he'd meant to let it be. She looked at him for another long moment. The white light overhead made both of them look stripped, him of color, her of anything except the faint bioluminescent shimmer. It occurred to him, distantly and with the same involuntary attention he couldn't switch off, that she was genuinely striking in a way that had nothing to do with the strangeness of her biology and everything to do with the quality of her stillness. The way she stood in the corridor's frame like she'd grown there. Like the corridor was hers, and she was simply waiting to see what he would do with that. "Come with me," she said. "Am I under arrest?" She considered this for a moment, and the consideration was visible, not theatrical but real, as if the question had a genuine and non-obvious answer. "Not yet," she said. He looked at the camera sweep behind him, now back on its cycle. He looked at the exit she was blocking. He looked at her face. "All right," he said. The security alcove she brought him to was not an interrogation room. He'd been in interrogation rooms, not as the person asking, as the person answering, twice in his service, when engagements had required formal after-action review, and they had a particular design philosophy, a particular smell, and a particular arrangement. Table in the center, everything else pushed back, the ceiling calibrated to a specific low that wasn't accidental, lighting positioned to make the person across the table feel slightly exposed. This room had a bench along one wall, a rank of lockers, and a desk console pushed into the corner like an afterthought. It smelled like solvent and something faintly floral he couldn't immediately identify. One of the lockers had a small decorative marker on it, a vel-cast symbol he almost recognized, rendered in a material that caught the light at a different frequency than the metal around it. She sat at the desk without turning her back on him. That was professional, keeping him in sightline without making the posture aggressive. She pulled up his chip record on the console, and she read it the way she'd looked at his chip in the corridor. Not scanning for the flagged fields, but reading the whole, the way a person reads a face. "You served in the Expeditionary," she said. It wasn't a question. "3rd Sector Reach, 7th Marine Unit. You entered service at 18 Standard. You were promoted to lieutenant at 23. A pause. You received a medical discharge at 26. "That's right. The nature of the medical discharge isn't in this file. The file has what the file has." She turned to look at him. Not suspiciously, it wasn't the look of someone hunting a discrepancy. It was the look of someone who had noticed a shape in the negative space of a record and wanted to understand what the shape was. "It also doesn't have any warrants," she said. "It doesn't have any criminal designation. It doesn't have demerits, conduct flags, or any record of detention. There is nothing in this file, Davin Creel, which is itself a kind of answer." She leaned back slightly in the chair. A man with nothing recorded is not a man who has done nothing. He is a man who has ensured that what he has done is not recorded, or a man who has ensured that what has been done to him is not recorded. She paused. "These are not the same situation." He looked at her. "Your chip suppressor is 7th Reach military grade, discontinued manufacture," she continued, as if building a list. "Your kit bag has a field compression function built into the strap, not a civilian feature. You move like someone who has spent a very long time moving in a way that produces no sound. These are not the traits of a civilian who got tired of registration queues." He said nothing. "What is your actual destination?" she asked. "Out," he said, "past the Vel boundary, the settlements." She was quiet for a moment. The settlements past the Vel boundary were not a secret. They existed on every intersector chart, but they had a specific character that most people understood without needing to discuss. Unaffiliated, ungoverned by unified charter, deeply difficult to reach, and extremely good at being unknowing about whoever arrived there. "The settlements are not governed by unified charter," she said. "No," Davin agreed, "they're not." Something shifted in her expression. Not much. He wouldn't have caught it except that he'd been watching her face since the moment she'd stepped into the corridor, because her face was what he had to read. She was between him and every exit, and a person's face, however alien, told you more about their next action than their hands did if you knew how to watch it. What he caught wasn't suspicion, wasn't pity. It was something more precise than either, the particular expression of a person who has heard something they recognize without expecting to. "You're not running from something," she said slowly. "You're running toward the edge of the map. The two things feel the same, and they're sometimes the same, but they don't always have the same shape." She studied him. "Which is it for you?" Davin looked at the floor. The tile was Ketharan hexagonal, the blue-gray kind, the standard administrative grade. "I don't know anymore," he said honestly. She stood up from the desk and came to stand nearer, not sitting beside him, just reducing the distance, closing it down to a conversational range that wasn't threatening but was direct. The floral smell was stronger, not perfume, he thought. Just something in her biology, something that was probably entirely normal for her kind and only remarkable to him because he was human, and his senses were calibrated for different signals. Her shadow fell across the floor at a long angle from the overhead light, blue-dark against the gray tile. "I have an interest in this question," she said. "That is not purely professional." He looked up at that. "My name is Ciara Veldeth," she said. "I am the senior security officer of this station. I have the authority to hold you for 72 standard hours without filing a formal charge, and I have the authority to look away from a suppressed transit chip if the situation warrants it, because both of those authorities exist within my discretion." She paused. "I am also, at this moment, choosing to tell you my name, which is not required by any regulation governing this conversation and is entirely my choice." The directness of it was so undecorated that it took him a moment to catch the weight underneath it. "Why?" he said. "Because," she said, "in approximately 9 standard minutes, the maintenance corridor you were walking will be on active patrol. You would have been caught by an officer with significantly less discretion than I have." She met his gaze. "I found you first. That is not an accident. I have been watching the blind spot patterns in this station for 4 days because something in the movement data suggested someone was using them. I waited in the corridor tonight. You are the first person who used a gap I deliberately left open." He stared at her, the station breathed, the environmental system cycled. "You left the gap," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "I wanted to see who would use it," she said. "A person who uses a genuine gap moves one way. A person who uses a gap that isn't actually a gap moves differently. You moved differently. You verified the gap before you committed to it. That told me something." She looked at him steadily. "And I wanted to see what kind of person you were when the lights came on." He was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of person am I?" he asked. It came out low, not defensive, genuinely asking, in the particular way that a man asks a question when he's stopped trusting his own answer and needs a different vantage. Ciara Veldeth looked at him with the white eyes that were not blank at all, that were in fact the most precisely attentive eyes he'd encountered in a very long time, and she said, "Someone who did not run when the lights came on, and who told me his actual name." She did not put him in detention. She put him in a secondary berth on the administrative level, a small room, clean, with a bunk and a narrow viewport that showed a sliver of deep space, stars unhurried and motionless. And she told him he had until morning cycle to decide whether he was going to tell her why he was running. He didn't sleep. He lay on the bunk and watched the stars through the sliver of viewport, and he didn't tell himself to sleep, because he knew that instruction wouldn't be taken. Instead, he let his mind do what it had been doing for 3 months, which was circle, and he watched it circle the way he'd watch a drain, knowing the direction, knowing what it was going toward, not quite able to stop it. He thought about Jessa 6. He always thought about Jessa 6 when he wasn't in immediate motion, because Jessa 6 was the thing he was in motion to avoid, and the moment motion stopped, Jessa 6 was there, waiting with the patience of a fact. The engagement on the 3rd day. The field hospital the size of a cargo module, the blood on the deck that the environmental system couldn't filter fast enough, the sounds. The official report that said 17 KIA. The actual number, which was 31, which he knew because he had been there and had counted twice, had sat in a corner with his back against a wall, and counted the faces he remembered and arrived at 31, and then been called into his commanding officer's office. The Co's office had been clean. That had struck him at the time, the incongruity of the clean office next to the cargo module full of blood smell. The Co had given him a glass of something that might have been real water and might have been synthetic, and had told him, in the measured and reasonable voice of a man who had given this speech before, that the numbers in the field report were going to reflect the strategic necessity of not alarming the civilian population of the sector, and that Davin was going to be the one to file that report. And that Davin's alternative was a court-martial on charges that were not true, but that were also not provably not true, which was all the threshold a military tribunal needed in a sector that had been politically unstable for 3 years. Davin had sat in the chair across from the clean desk and felt the floor go liquid under him. He had signed the report. He had gone home. Home had been a small apartment in a city he'd grown up in, which was supposed to feel like something and instead felt like a stage set of a place, correct in its dimensions, recognizable in its details, completely unable to tell him who he was supposed to be now. He had sat in the apartment for 2 months. His sister had visited twice, and he had been, both times, unable to tell her why he wasn't all right when the question was asked, because the words would have required looking directly at the thing, and looking directly at the thing required acknowledging that his signature was on a document that said 17 when he had counted 31, and that 14 families had been given a number that was wrong, and that his co had retired with a commendation. At month 3, he had picked up the kit bag and left. He hadn't told anyone he was going. He hadn't filed a transit notice. He had just become, gradually and then completely, a person without a recorded location, moving from station to station through the maintenance corridors and the camera gaps, spending money carefully, covering distance, going farther from Jessa 6 in physical space, and not farther from it in any way that mattered. He lay on the bunk and watched the stars in the sliver of viewport, and the stars went nowhere, and neither did he. In the morning cycle, a knock on the door, measured not urgent. Ciara Veldeth did not bring food. She brought a datapad and a second chair she'd apparently carried from the corridor, and she set the chair in front of the bunk and sat in it with the datapad resting on her knee, and she looked at him with the white eyes. "Tell me about Jessa 6, she said. He went very still, the way you go still when something appears too fast to prepare for. "It was in your service record," she said. Her voice was the same as the night before, low, even, professionally measured, and also, beneath that, something else that he couldn't name yet. Not the version currently active in the transit systems registry. I pulled the sealed record. I have clearance for sealed records because I am senior security officer of this station, and you are currently a person of unclear status, and unclear status gives me access to contextual information." She paused. "The sealed record has a different number than the active file." He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. His hands were a reference he used when he needed to look at something and couldn't look at what he was actually thinking about. "You signed a report you knew was wrong," she said. Not accusation. The sound of someone naming a thing precisely so that it can be looked at together, in the light, without the distortion that unnamed things carry. "My co told me," he stopped. "I know what your co told you," she said. The sealed record contains a transcript of the conversation. It was recorded by a review mechanism that your co didn't know was active. She paused, and her voice stayed level. "The coercion is documented. The threat of false court-martial is documented. The political context of the engagement, the civilian population data, the strategic calculus he cited is documented." She looked at him. "You were placed in an impossible position. You chose the option that appeared survivable. And then you found it wasn't survivable in the way it was supposed to be." He looked at his hands and didn't speak. "I signed it," he said finally. His voice came out flat, not self-pitying, just a statement of a specific fact that everything else followed from. "Yes," she said. 31 people, he said, "and the record says 17, and the 14 who are missing from the record have families somewhere who were told their people died in an engagement that the official number makes look smaller than it was. Those families never received a full account. They never received the accurate count. My commanding officer retired with a commendation and he stopped again. The thing he had been circling around presented itself very plainly in the morning cycle light of a small berth on a station he hadn't planned to stay on, and he looked at it. I signed it. I let him do it, because he gave me a choice between two things I couldn't survive, and I chose the one that kept me alive in the immediate physical sense, and it turned out that the cost of that was that I couldn't stay anywhere afterward. I couldn't stay in my city. I couldn't stay in my apartment. I couldn't stay in any place long enough for the person I'd been before Jessa 6 to notice I wasn't him anymore. The room was small, and the morning cycle was quiet, and Sayara Veldeth sat in her chair and listened without moving, without interrupting, without the slight forward lean that people sometimes did when they were waiting for their turn. "What were you going to do?" she said, when he'd been silent long enough that the silence was the statement. "In the settlements." "Disappear," he said. "Find labor. There's always labor in uncharted settlements, physical work, the kind that doesn't care about your record. Get far enough out that the name Davin Creel doesn't connect to anything." He paused. "Not have a face that was attached to what happened." "That is not a plan," she said quietly. "That is a postponement." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "A plan," she said, "involves turning to face the direction the thing is. You've been moving in the other direction for 3 months. The thing does not move. It is not in pursuit of you. It is simply remaining where it is, at Jessa 6, in the sealed record, in the accounts of the other survivors who also have not spoken. And you are moving in a very large arc around it, which is exhausting and expensive, and which terminates, eventually, in the same location." The silence had a different quality than it had had when he'd come in. Not comfortable, it was too true for comfortable, but different in the way that a room feels after a window has been opened. The same room with the same proportions, but something new moving through it. "What would you have me do?" he said slowly. "With a sealed record and a co with political protection and 14 missing people and survivors who haven't talked because the same coercion that worked on me worked on them. I signed a document. It exists. My name is on it." "Your name is on a document that you were coerced into signing," she said, "under threat of a fabricated court-martial. That coercion is also documented, in the same sealed record." She looked at him steadily. "A name on a coerced document is not the same as a name on a willing one, even though they look the same on the page." He stared at her. His mind moved slowly towards something he hadn't let himself approach. "The record already contains the coercion," he said. "Yes," she said. "The sealed record contains the full conversation, the threat, the political framing, and your co's explicit instruction. What it does not yet have is a person requesting that it be unsealed and reviewed." She let that sit for a moment. "I am not in a position to do that. It is outside my authority. There are bodies that are within their authority to do it." "Which bodies?" "Several," she said. "The Veterans Accountability Review is one. They operate independently of the command structure. Their mandate specifically covers engagements in the third sector reach in the period of your service." He was quiet for a long time. The morning cycle light was warming through the viewport, the station's artificial dawn beginning its slow brightening. "You sat in a corridor," he said slowly, "for 4 days, waiting for someone to use a gap you'd deliberately left open." "Yes," she said. "And when you found me, the first thing you asked was my name." "Yes." "And you didn't file a charge, and you didn't contact Port Authority, and you didn't send me to detention. You brought me here and gave me somewhere to sleep." "Yes." "Why?" he said. All the individual whys of the past 12 hours compressed into one. Not just why the gap, not just why the patience, not just why the sealed record, all of it. Why? Sayara Veldeth considered this. Her hands, which had been still in her lap throughout, moved slightly, one thumb tracing the edge of her other palm in a gesture that seemed unconscious, private, something she wasn't aware of doing. On my world Veldeth, the origin system, the station takes its naming conventions from there is a practice when a person carries something that cannot be outrun. She paused. They are taken to what translates as a witnessing place, not a court of judgment, not a tribunal. A place where someone without stake in the outcome agrees to hear the full account. Everything. Not to judge it, only to hold it accurately, to be the other mind that knows the complete shape of the thing, so that the person carrying it is no longer carrying it entirely alone. He looked at her. The understanding, she said, is that a weight carried alone becomes heavier in a specific way, not because weight increases, it does not, but because the carrying of it alone creates a distortion. The person carrying it begins to lose the shape of it, it becomes formless, becomes everything, becomes the reason they cannot stay anywhere or look at anyone directly. She met his eyes. A weight that has been witnessed, fully, completely, with accuracy and without diminishment, becomes something with edges, something with a defined shape, and a thing with a defined shape can be carried. Is that what you're offering? He said. I am asking, she said, if you want me to. It took 3 hours. He didn't plan to tell her everything. He planned the outline, the engagement, the numbers, the co's office, the report. But the outline kept requiring context, and the context required earlier context, and what began as a strategic account became something else without him deciding to make it something else. By the end of the first hour, he told her about the engagement itself, the 3 days, the field hospital that was actually a cargo module, the quality of the light through the module's single-port window, the way the deck had smelled in the hours before the environmental system caught up with what had happened, the faces, the sounds, the specific moment in the 3rd day when he'd known the count was 31 and not 17. By the end of the 2nd hour, he'd told her about the co's office, the clean desk, the glass of synthetic water. The precise words the man had used, he'd replayed them often enough that they were exact now, preserved in the way that things are preserved when the mind can't stop touching them. The feeling of the floor going liquid, the pen in his hand. The moment after he'd signed when the co had said, in a tone of something like satisfaction, "Good man." By the 3rd hour, he'd told her things he hadn't known he was going to tell anyone. About going home, and the stage-set feeling of his own city, and the 2 visits from his sister who had a specific way of sitting across from him with her hands in her lap that meant she was worried, but had been told by someone or some instinct not to push. About the dog he'd had as a kid, a big brown dog of no particular breed, lazy and affectionate and completely irrelevant to anything except that the dog had died while he was deployed, and no one had thought it was something worth including in the communication because it was a dog. And he'd come home to the city and gone to the apartment, and the dog wasn't there, and he'd stood in the empty apartment and felt something tear that he couldn't locate. That might have been the dog, or might have been the 31, or might have been the signature, or might have been all of them. Because at some point, grief becomes undifferentiated and you can't sort out which loss is which. He talked and she listened. She asked very few questions, and when she asked, the questions were precise: dates, sequences, the specific chain of a thing, not auditing him for inconsistency, but building the account accurately, placing each element correctly in relation to the others. He understood that this was what she described, the witnessing. The other mind holding the shape of the thing so that it had a shape. When he finally stopped talking, the room was the same room, but it felt aired. "Davin Creel," she said. He looked at her. "You did not commit the crime at Jessa 6, she said. "You were coerced into participating in the misrepresentation of it. Those are not the same action, even though they feel like the same action from inside them. 14 families. 14 families deserve an accurate account," she said. "The person who could give it to them is sitting in this room. Running to the settlements removes that person from the equation." He was quiet with that. "The sealed record exists," she said. It contains the coercion. It contains the threat. It contains your co's explicit instructions. It contains the political calculation he cited to justify it. All of that is there. What is missing is a request for review and a live account from someone present at the engagement. She paused. Those are two things. The second one is harder than the first. But neither of them exists in the settlements past the Vel boundary. He looked at his hands again. They looked like his hands. The same hands that had held a pen in a clean office on a station a long time ago, and that had been shaking slightly while they held the pen, which his co had not noticed or had chosen not to notice. What if the review doesn't? He started. I can't promise outcomes, she said. No one can. Your co has political protection. Political protection is real and it limits what accountability looks like in a just direction. Her voice stayed even. What I can tell you is that the record is correctable, and that the families can be given accurate numbers, and that the other survivors, if they know that someone has moved first, may also move. These things are not justice in the complete sense, but they are not nothing. He stayed on Kithara. Not by plan. There was no plan for staying. The same way there had been no plan for the settlements past the Vel boundary, only the direction. But Sayara processed him through the station's temporary resident registry on the third day, and there was a labor post available in the engineering maintenance division, and he needed a berth that wasn't charity, and the practical sequence of these things added up to staying in a way that felt less like a decision, and more like a fact he'd agreed to. He ate in the common hall. He slept in the berth with the sliver of viewport and the slow stars. He sent a long, encrypted message to his sister that he'd been trying to write for 3 months. 7 drafts of it had existed and been deleted, and he wrote this one in a single sitting without stopping, in the berth, with the stars in the window, and sent it before he could change his mind. Her reply came 8 hours later and contained no questions, only a specific thing she remembered about the summer he was 14 that had nothing to do with any of it, and everything to do with the fact that she was glad he was somewhere. He saw Sayara every day. Not always by arrangement. Kithara was a mid-sized station, and its corridors converged in patterns that meant a person working engineering maintenance, and eating in the common hall and sleeping on the administrative level, passed through the security wing's outer corridor twice in a standard cycle. He learned this without looking for it. The way you learn the geography of a place you're inhabiting properly rather than moving through. The first pass was at 6:30 when her shift began, and if he was at the junction of the outer corridor at 6:31, which he started to be, not quite consciously, not quite deliberately, though he would have been dishonest to say it was accidental, she would emerge from the security alcove entrance. She didn't stop to talk at length. They walked as far as the junction, which took about 4 minutes, and they talked about small things. The station cycle, a repair he'd done, something in the maintenance data she'd found interesting. It was the most consistent human, or rather, the most consistent social interaction he'd had in 3 months, and it had the slightly startling quality of all such things after absence. The discovery that talking to someone could be ordinary. On the 4th day, she gave him a datapad with a file on it. They were at the junction. She held it out without announcement. The Veterans Accountability Review, she said. The contact officer for 3rd Sector Reach engagements. I've prepared a summary of the sealed record situation and the coercion documentation, not a formal submission, just the framing document that's required before a submission can be received. He looked at the datapad, then at her. You prepared a summary. Yes. When? Over the past 4 days, she said, as if this were the obvious answer to an obvious question. A submission to the review body requires a framing document. The framing document must characterize the nature of the sealed record and the grounds for requesting review. This is specific drafting that requires someone to look closely at the material. She paused. Looking closely at the material is difficult when you are the person the material is about. It's easier for someone, without personal connection to the content. He held the datapad. "I didn't ask you to do this," he said. "No," she agreed. "I did it because you were going to have difficulty doing it yourself in the beginning. Later becomes easier, but the beginning requires someone to look at it who can." She said this without any softness that would have made it condescending, and without any clinical detachment that would have made it cold. Just the statement of a practical situation and a practical response. "Ciara," he said. "Yes." He started to ask the question and stopped, because he had asked it before in its smaller versions, and she had answered each version. "Why did you leave the gap? Why did you turn the lights on instead of drawing a weapon? Why did you listen for 3 hours? And she had answered each of those, but the version accumulating now was larger. It covered all of it. "Why are you doing any of this?" he said. She looked at him with the white eyes in the working light of the outer corridor junction, the station moving around them in its ordinary cycle. "Because I was *Kethavar for 2 years, she said, "and no one did it for me, and it was harder than it needed to be." He stared at her. "Kethavar*, she said, "is a Vel-Death word. It means roughly a person who has made themselves smaller than their actual size in order to continue existing. There is no judgment in the word. It is simply the word for the condition." She paused. "I recognized the movement pattern in the blind spots because I know how a *Kethavar* moves. I moved that way for 2 years. I moved that way through 8 stations, including 2 in this system, before I stopped." "What were you running from?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "A different war," she said. "A different set of orders that should not have been followed, and a different choice that looked survivable at the time and was not survivable in the way I'd expected." Her voice was the same level as it always was, not flat, not controlled to hide something, simply even. The evenness of someone who has visited a place many times and no longer needs to prepare to go there. "I ran for 2 years. I came to this station. I found work that used what the running had built, the pattern recognition, the observation, the understanding of how people move when they are hiding. I found that the skills of *Kethavar are genuinely useful in security work." A slight pause. "And I found, eventually, that the thing I had been running from had not changed shape or size while I ran. It was still the same weight. All that had changed was that I was more tired." "What did you do," he said, "when you stopped?" "I went back," she said. "I submitted a live account to the review body of my system. The process took 8 months. The outcome was partial. The people responsible were not fully held to account because people with power rarely are fully. But the record was corrected. The families of the dead received accurate numbers. Other survivors, when they learned that I had moved first, also submitted accounts. The picture became clear in a way it hadn't been before." She looked at him. "I am not telling you that doing this will feel like completion. It will not feel like completion. It will feel like a very long process with a partial outcome. But the record will say the right number. And that is not nothing." He held the datapad with the framing document she'd prepared. "Kethavar*, he said. "Yes," she said, "and you are, but it is a condition, not a nature. People stop being Kethavar*. I stopped." She tilted her head. "You stopped in a corridor on deck 7 when the lights came on. That is when it started for you." He submitted the framing document to the Veterans Accountability Review at 2 in the morning cycle, 11 days after he'd arrived on Kethara. He sat in the berth with the stars in the sliver of viewport, and the datapad with the document in his hands that were shaking slightly. Not dramatically, just slightly, the fine tremor of a system that has been calibrated to run away from something for a long time suddenly being asked to run toward it. He read the framing document through 3 times, his and hers together in it, the facts of Jessa 6 in precise sequence, the coercion documented, the transcript of the co's conversation referenced by record number, the grounds for unsealing the sealed file laid out in the formal language of the review body's intake protocol. He submitted it. He set the datapad down. He sat very still. The stars in the sliver of viewport didn't move. The station breathed. He was still there. He told Ciara the next morning. They were at the junction, 6:31. She said, "How do you feel?" He thought about this honestly. "Like I jumped off something," he said, "and I haven't landed yet." "That will continue for some time," she said. "Then you will land. The landing will be hard. And then you will know what the ground feels like." He nodded. They walked to the junction and passed it that morning, past the usual turning point, further into the station's lower corridors, which opened eventually onto the level 4 stairwell with the large viewport. They didn't plan it. They just didn't turn off when they usually did, and neither of them mentioned not turning off. And by the time they were standing at the viewport with the full sweep of the system's outer belt in front of them, it was simply where they were. He looked at the belt, ice and rock, slow and patient, going nowhere. She stood beside him, and they were quiet in the way of two people who have already said a great deal to each other, and are comfortable with what the silence contains. In the 6th week on Cathara, the Veterans Accountability Review sent a preliminary acknowledgement. His account had been received. The sealed record had been flagged for review. An investigative contact would be assigned within 30 standard days. 30 standard days was 30 standard days. He had a labor post. He had a berth. He had the junction at 6:31 and the level 4 viewport on Tuesday cycles and the common hall at meal times. He also, at some point in the 6th week, he couldn't have said exactly when, only that it was true, stopped feeling like a person who was staying somewhere temporarily. He started knowing where the maintenance panels were, not because he was mapping exits but because he worked with them. He started knowing the other workers by name and by the particular quality of how they showed up to a shift. Nev, who was always early and always complaining about the early. Harriet, who was late but worked 2 hours past shift without acknowledgement. The 3 Vel secondary staff who ate together and occasionally included him in the conversation with the easy incorporation of people who don't distinguish much between in-group and out-group. He started knowing the station the way you know a place you live in. On a Tuesday cycle evening, station time, arbitrary designation, though it had become real to him, he and Ciara sat at the end of the level 4 stairwell with trays from the common hall, the large viewport in front of them showing the full outer belt. The food was unremarkable. The view was very good. 7 weeks tomorrow, he said. 49 days, she said. I was supposed to be gone in 1. You were supposed to go to the edge of the map and not have a name, she said, not unkindly. What happened was somewhat different. He looked at the belt. One of the mining drones was at the right angle to the system star, throwing a long, bright needle of light across the dark, like a scratch on black glass. Is this a problem, he said, for you professionally? I processed you through proper temporary registry on day 3, she said. Your labor post is fully documented. Your submission to the review body is a matter of record. You are legally a temporary resident of this station. She paused, and the pause had a quality to it, a slight widening, a breath of something different from the operational register. Is that the question you're asking? Not entirely, he said. She looked at him. In the viewport's ambient light, her skin had the deep blue-black shimmer that had first been visible under the maintenance corridor's harsh whites, and her white eyes caught the light the way water catches light, not reflecting it exactly, but holding it briefly before releasing it, so that looking at her was like looking at something that contained what it saw. No, she said, answering the question he'd actually asked. It is not a problem. He looked at the viewport, and then at her, and there was a specific quality to the moment, not the held-breath quality of a dramatic beat, but the quieter quality of two people who have been in each other's company long enough that the space between them has changed character, has become something with its own weight and warmth. In 3 months, he said, I stopped at 12 stations. I didn't tell anyone my real name at any of them. I covered 14 systems and I got farther from Jessa 6 in terms of distance, and I didn't get farther from it in any way that mattered. No, she said. And then I walked into a corridor that had a gap that wasn't actually a gap. Yes. And you turned the lights on, he said. She considered this. I turned the lights on, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The mining drone completed its transit across the viewport and disappeared behind the belt's shadow. I didn't know, he said. When I submitted that framing document, I didn't know what it would feel like. I thought it would feel like relief, maybe, or dread. He looked at the belt. It felt like I don't have the right word. It felt like I'd said something true out loud that I'd been saying silently for months, and that the act of saying it out loud didn't change the truth, but it changed the scale of it somehow. Like the truth was still the same size, but I was slightly larger. Sayara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "On Vel Death, when a asterisk Kethavar finally stops, when the running ends, there is a second word. Sevaketh. It doesn't have a clean translation into standard. The closest is asterisk, the place where you are found. Not found as in discovered or apprehended, found as in located. The way a navigator marks a position and says, 'Here.'" He looked at her. "I was asterisk Sevaketh in this station," she said. "I came here running, and something in the quality of this station, the particular configuration of work I could do here, the specific gap in what was needed that I could fill, made me able to stop. I have been here 9 years. She paused. "I don't know if this is your Sevaketh asterisk. I know that you stopped here. I know that you are not running at this moment. I know that the thing you were running from now has a direction, the review body, the unsealed record, which is different from having no direction." Asterisk Sevaketh, he said, trying the shape of the word in his mouth. "Yes," she said. And they sat at the stairwell at the end of level 4, in front of the large viewport, while the outer belt turned with the patient slowness of old things, and the system star was a steady bright thing at the edge of the glass, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else that needed saying right now, and the silence between them was the kind that has warmth in it. The review took 9 months. In the end, the sealed record was formally unsealed. The coercion documentation entered the review body's evidence record. 3 other former members of the 7th Marine Unit submitted accounts to the review body within the first 60 days of Davin's submission going active. They had been waiting, it turned out, for someone to move first, and the review body's contact officer told him later that this was not unusual, that there was frequently a first person, and that the first person was often not the one who had moved first for the most complex reasons. Only the one who had arrived at the threshold at the right moment. The Co's commendation was rescinded. He was not imprisoned, powerful people rarely were fully, and the political protection was real, and it limited the outcome in the ways she had told him it would. But the finding against him was formal and public, and in the sector's political landscape, a formal and public finding had consequences that moved through careers and affiliations in ways that weren't always visible immediately, but were real. The families of the 31 were given the accurate count. A correction of record was issued. It was not, the review body's officer told him carefully, the same as justice in a complete sense. He said he knew that. He received the review body's final finding on a morning cycle in the 9th month, at 6:14, 16 minutes before he would have been at the outer corridor junction. He read it in his berth, sitting on the edge of the bunk, the stars in the viewport now as familiar as the shape of his own hands, and he read it 3 times, and then he put the datapad down and sat with his hands on his knees. He thought about 31. He thought about the faces he'd counted, some of them clear in his memory, some of them blurred now by time and distance, all of them real, all of them the right number. He thought about the 14 families who now had the right number. He thought about the specific weight of a thing when it has been witnessed and named and set into the record correctly. It didn't feel like relief exactly. Relief implied the thing was gone. The thing wasn't gone. 31 was still 31, and Jessa 6 was still Jessa 6, and the weight of those facts wasn't going anywhere. But the weight had edges now. A defined shape. A thing with a defined shape could be carried. He washed his face. He got dressed. He walked to the outer corridor junction. Ciara emerged from the security alcove at 6:31. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the maintenance corridor on the first night, with the white eyes that were not blank at all, the white eyes that read things precisely, and without the distortion of wanting something to be different from what it was. "It came through," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said. "The families." "Notification issued," he said. "The findings public." She nodded. She didn't say anything for a moment. The station moved around them. The 6:31 cycle, people going to their shifts, the environmental system at its morning setting, all the ordinary motion of a place that was simply alive. "How are you?" she said. "Getting there," he said. Getting there was more accurate than fine, and less accurate than the full truth, which was complex, but it was the correct answer for a corridor at 6:31. She fell into step beside him. They walked past the junction this morning, past the usual turning-off point, further down toward the lower levels, toward level 4 and the stairwell and the large viewport. Not by discussion, not announced. Just by continuing. The way two people continue when they have been going in the same direction long enough that it has become the direction. The outer belt was bright in the morning light of the system star, ice that had been ice for longer than either of them had existed, catching the star and throwing it back differently, the slow, patient fire of very old things in morning light. He stood at the viewport beside her, and he was, for the first time in a very long time, in a way he could actually feel where he actually was, not moving through, not planning the next corridor, not mapping exits. "Here. *Seveketh, he said quietly. Ciara Veldeth looked at him with the eyes that held the light and then released it, and she said, "Yes." He looked at the belt, and then at her, and there was nothing dramatic about the moment, no particular music, no gesture that resolved everything into a neat conclusion. There was just the viewport and the old ice and the two of them in the morning light of a station that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, something more like home than anywhere he'd been in a very long time. "I'm not going to the edge of the map," he said. She said no. "I'm going to stay here for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "Is that?" "I know," she said again, and the word was the same word but differently weighted, carrying a different load, and she didn't say anything else. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look directly at most things for most of the past year, and she looked back with the white eyes that caught the light and held it and released it, and the luminescent shimmer under her deep blue-black skin was warm in the morning cycle glow, in a way it hadn't been under the maintenance corridor's harsh whites. It was a different light. Everything looked different in the right light. He thought about the corridor, the gap he'd walked into, the lights that had come on, the figure at the far end who had been standing and not drawing a weapon, just standing, just waiting. He thought about the first question she'd asked and the last one, and the 9 months between. He thought about 31 names on a corrected record, and 14 families with accurate numbers, and 3 other former members of the 7th who had moved when they'd seen him move. He thought about his sister's message, and the things she'd remembered about the summer he was 14, and about the dog who had been gone for years now and whom he had finally, properly, mourned. He thought, this is what the ground feels like. Hard as she'd said it would be, but ground. The system star moved over the ice and the rock in the long, slow patience of something that has nowhere to be except exactly where it is, and neither did he, and that was enough. More than enough. The place where you are found is not always the place you aimed for. It is the place where the lights come on and you stay still, and someone is standing at the end of the corridor, not to stop you, but to be there when you finally stop yourself. Sevaketh. Here,